Okay, so welcome everyone to this presentation on Saturn in Capricorn. So I've titled it Life in Lockdown. And of course, the world over is experiencing some um, degree of lockdown or other, and that will continue likely for some time, especially over the winter months. And I'll show you why that is in terms of the astrology. And then how do we manage it better? How can we actually invite this into our life in a way that's not, or at least doesn't feel as imposed upon us? Because oftentimes Saturn issues, and I'll talk all about the planet Saturn and the sign Capricorn and what they represent, but they often feel forced upon us. And how can we actually purposely bring those restrictions, what are restrictions basically, into our life? So maybe ways, practical tips that could help you bring those in. And in terms of my background as an Indian astrologer, obviously I'm not Indian, I'm Irish, but I study Indian astrology. It's an Eastern tradition, and how they view Saturn and Capricorn and this transit and how they approach it with remedial measures. So I'll give you a few of those remedial measures as well as my, practical approach and tips and tricks. So let me begin with Saturn. So Saturn is the ruler of the air element in Indian astrology. We divide the 5 visible planets into the 5 elements that make up all of life experience. So Saturn is the air, and air is the most challenging of the elements. And it's the most important of the elements to keep in check, because if it gets out of hand, if there's too much air in our life, then there's too much, of course, restriction, too much detachment, too much drying up. Air dries things up. So we can feel isolated, we can feel lonely, we can feel depressed, we can feel anxious, we can feel on edge. So it's important to bring in the more positive attributes of air. And of course, the inevitable attributes of air, which is that life is a process of drying up. As we get older, we dry up and we age, and that's what ultimately leads to our death. So it's water that gives life. The element of water is life, and the element of air dries it up. And in the process as well, it actually disturbs it. If you think of like water and then air disturbing the calmness of the water. So it can create all sorts of anxieties and fears. And of course, living in a lockdown, living in a pandemic has stoked those a lot. So Saturn has many indications, including poverty, as well as austerity and frugalness. So depending on what spectrum you're on or what angle you're approaching that at, it could be somebody who is, in dire straits, in poverty, as we're seeing around the world. But it could be somebody who is very frugal and resourceful, and some, austerities absolutely are called for. Now, the reason that this is more relevant for us right now and in 2020 is that Saturn, as I'm going to speak about, moved into the sign Capricorn in January. And Saturn is particularly strong in Capricorn. So it's very strong in giving its effects, and its effects in both good and bad ways, if you want to look at it. And we'll look at those things. But in any which way, and it's a spectrum, whatever way you experience Saturn yourself personally, whether it's fear or anxiety, or if it's isolation, or on the other side, it's self-imposed restriction and, blissful states of being as well, because that's the other possibility of Saturn. Some people are loving lockdown and loving the isolation. Whichever way you land on the spectrum, it's strong, it's in our minds, it's to the forefront this year because of its strong position in Capricorn. So Saturn is also fear, as I said, anxiety and worry. It's also our sins, imprisonment and slavery. Another, word for Saturn is Satan, So it also represents laborers, menial tasks, and service work. It represents renunciation, loss, and detachment. form, structure, and the establishment. So anything that's been worked on and formed is Saturn. But through that form or structure, whatever it might be, you've got something in your life, you have a way of doing things, you have an experience, you have a whatever, fill in the blank. That is itself a limitation because it is now or cannot be as easily something else. So it also represents limitation, restriction, and pressure. Sometimes limitation can be pressurizing. Sometimes it's just pure focus, but sometimes it can feel restrictive and pressurizing. And it also represents longevity, old age, and death. So again, that's a spectrum. It could be that, Saturn shows longevity. So somebody actually who can, whether they live a long life or not, it's longevity, but it can show someone who's able to stick it out for the long haul, and shows old age, for example. So someone making it to old age. But therefore, obviously, it also shows death. So it shows quite a lot of things, obviously, Saturn. It's the planet of form and structure. And so it's an important planet to consider. The sign Capricorn now, where Saturn is currently placed, it moved in here, as I said, in January. So it's particularly strong, especially in the first few degrees of Capricorn. So in 2020, it's very impactful. Saturn is a very practical and pragmatic sign. You might know, having read something about Capricorn. And it's a very stoic sign. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Stoicism in a while, and why Stoicism is a more advantageous philosophy to take on board now. Capricorn is also ambitious, though, and it's also reliable, persevering, hardworking, cautious, and prudent. So it's an earth sign. So it's Saturn's earth sign. So it kind of takes all of those issues I talked about with Saturn and it applies them very practically. And that can be a good thing. So why we're seeing, for example, people really stepping up and doing what's necessary and honoring the people who normally would be in the background, the Saturn type of people, the laborers, the servants, the people, service work, the caregivers, the people working in hospitals, all of these people who work in those kind of service industries as well. All of those people are pushed to the forefront now, which is like putting Saturn out center stage this year because Saturn is so strong. So it brings it into the earthy realm. It makes it more practical. Like if you don't get the help you need, if people don't do the job they need to do, then, you know, it's not going to be helpful. Saturn in Capricorn is very much about doing what the necessary. So let me just jump back a little bit in history, not too far. I'm going to go back 2 cycles and bring it up to date in this current cycle. So Saturn takes 30 years or so to go around the zodiac. So if we go back 2 cycles ago, about 60 years ago, 1960 was the 2 times ago when Saturn was in Capricorn. And then I'll talk about the last time and now this time. So 1960 to 63, Saturn was in Capricorn. And just as back then, and just as now, it was conjunct Jupiter. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that in a minute. But there was quite a lot of things going on in the world that are relevant to what is happening now, and that were relevant to the next time. And I'll show you the next time. So the first thing is that JFK was inaugurated. Now, one of the things about Saturn in Capricorn, conjunct Jupiter, which I'm going to talk about, because Jupiter is like the other side of the coin in a way, is that it's a bit of boom bust. Saturn is restrictive, is limiting. Jupiter is expansive, it's growth. So when you put both of them together, there's a bit of a boom bust situation going on. And of course, the boom bust in that early 60s, the most obvious example is JFK being elected and then being assassinated. So those are the 2 things. He was obviously inaugurated, actually just as Saturn moved into Capricorn in January of 1961. And then he was assassinated in 1963 when Saturn was, and when the moon had joined Saturn, because Saturn actually stays in Capricorn for 3 years. So that's another thing to take into account. The other thing that's really relevant, and that was relevant for the next cycle, and that's relevant for this cycle now also, is 1961 began the construction of the Berlin Wall. So one of the things Saturn represents, as I said, its structure, its form, its limitation. One of the things it is, more than anything, if you think about Saturn out there in the boundary of space, the furthest planet out we can see with our naked eye, and the ringed planet, it very much represents boundaries. So we're obviously seeing this again in 2020, all about boundaries and putting up boundaries and countries having to shut off. So the Berlin Wall was an obvious example of that as Saturn moved into Capricorn in 1961. Then obviously the issue of boundaries coming up means that there's also the breaking of boundaries. So the first big break of boundary that happened in 1961 was the first man in space, a Soviet man. So Yuri Gagarin. So basically it shows the boundary, but it also shows the breaking of a boundary. And so we're seeing this theme again in 2020. There was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's another big thing that happened, of course. This was also because it was complicated at the time when Saturn was in Capricorn in 1962. The South Node, which is the eclipse, was there as well. So that created all this kind of unnerving kind of transit where it wasn't really sure what was going to happen. There was a lot of fear. This is also relevant for 2020, and I'll show you why. And like I said, then the JFK assassination occurred just as the moon came to join Saturn. And remember, Saturn and Jupiter had already come together, and a couple of years later, it's this boom bust kind of scenario all the time with Saturn and Jupiter. So I'm going to jump forward 30 years to the next time that Saturn came into Capricorn, and that was 1990 to 1993. So Saturn was in Capricorn during those years. Very different scenario here, because it isn't just about Saturn in Capricorn, it's also about Saturn with other planets and what those other planets are doing with it. So the first time, as I mentioned, it was with Jupiter and so on. This time it actually had just met with Neptune in Sagittarius before moving into Capricorn, and that's a very different ballgame. And why there's some hope here for the mid-20s when I'm going to look forward, because Jupiter or Saturn will meet with Neptune again by mid-decade, in this decade. So in 1990 and 1993, it had already met with Neptune in Sagittarius and had moved into Capricorn, and we saw the beginning of the World Wide Web. So what Neptune does more than anything is it dissolves boundaries. This is one of the things Neptune does. So Saturn is a boundary and it meets with Neptune, which dissolves things, blurs things. The World Wide Web blurred boundaries because we all of a sudden could connect with the world. So that's one thing. Second big thing was that it was the end of the Cold War. Again, blurring or dissolving of boundaries. The collapse of the Soviet Union, and very symbolically then the fall of the Berlin Wall. So that, remember, the last time Saturn was in Capricorn, they started the Berlin Wall. The next time Saturn came around and met with Neptune, brought it down. So it's always about building and bringing down boundaries with Saturn, but especially because it was with Neptune at the time. Nelson Mandela was freed at that time, and there was a more united Europe. So we had the EU. So let's jump forward another 30 years and we're up to date. And this is now Saturn again in Capricorn from 2020, began in January this year and lasts for 3 years. This time is so much more complicated because it's not only conjunct Jupiter as it was in the early 60s, it's now also conjunct Pluto, the Lord of the underworld. Many instances called the Lord of Death. In Indian astrology, we refer to it as Yama, the Lord of Death. Yama is also, though, translated as discipline, so the Lord of Discipline. But anyway, it's creating this kind of a lot more, this boundary situation and a lot of social unrest, a lot of boundary dissolving, but also reforming, because when we fear boundaries being dissolved, we have to put them in place even more. And this fear comes a lot from Pluto. So if you see this image here, this is the sign Sagittarius, and this is Capricorn. So this is the kind of transition between Sagittarius and Capricorn. And underneath the underlying fear kind of nipping at our heels is Pluto. So this is an image we could use for Pluto in terms of the signs. It's Scorpio. In modern astrology, Pluto rules Scorpio. So there's this underlying fear around this particular conjunction in 2020 because of Pluto. If Pluto wasn't there, it would have been perhaps similar to the 60s in a way. But it's the Pluto that's creating this kind of fear of end times. Because again, Saturn's the boundary. Pluto dissolves things. Not in the way that Neptune does, because Neptune is all about unity. Pluto is all about dissolution and decay and death and disease and endings. So it's quite a fearful kind of transit that we're having at the moment, and why, you know, every astrologer on the planet had predicted 2020 to be this kind of cataclysmic sort of turn of events, and a huge year for us all, and a reset in many ways. So Extinction Rebellion is one of the most obvious expressions of this Saturn-Pluto, because Saturn is, again, the boundary, Pluto is dissolving, is ending, and extinction would come under Pluto, and rebellion, I'll talk more about rebellion in terms of Saturn when I talk more about Saturn in a while. Saturn is rebellious also. It shows those people who are rebelling against the structures, the establishment, the order, because it represents both. If it's order and establishment and structure and limitation, it's that need to kind of break out of that order and rebel. So social distancing, obviously, where there's a lot of fear around boundaries at this time between each other. Disease and death, these are all indications of Saturn, Pluto coming together, as well as Jupiter. So we can see a lot more complicated a situation at this time in this cycle of Saturn in Capricorn, even though we're also seeing all the more positive attributes of this indication as we have in the past. In terms of hard work and responsibility and people doing the right thing and stepping up and being of help to others, and you know, that's also there. So as I mentioned before, it will show, therefore, if we're looking at these past few cycles, looking ahead, we can see that actually Saturn will meet Neptune in a few years. So whatever's been built now, whatever boundary's been built now, whatever's put in place now, will then start dissolving as a more unified, if I put it that way, unified field comes in by mid-decade. So by mid-decade, I'm referring to 2025, 26, right? Neptune and Saturn come together. So that will be a very different feel, most certainly, by the mid-decade. Let me just bring it back to Jupiter and Saturn, because let's maybe leave Pluto out of the equation for now and all the fear that that brings up. And let me just talk about Jupiter, because Jupiter is there too. And Jupiter is with Pluto, therefore, as well, all year. And that shows a lot of insights, a lot of other possibilities. But this webinar isn't about that so much. I don't want to go off topic too much, even though they're all combined. Let me just combine these two, because this is probably one of the more important ones going forward in 2020. Saturn here on the left, the symbol is here, and Jupiter on the right. And literally you can just take the Saturn symbol, turn it on its head, and you get the Jupiter symbol, and vice versa. So they're kind of like each other's opposites, right? And in terms of a philosophy, you could say, that you could apply to these, Saturn is this Stoicism. And for Jupiter, it's a New Age philosophy. So Saturn is restriction, is constriction, is limitation. Jupiter is expansion and growth and optimism. So the New Age Jupiter and the Saturn, or the Stoicism of Saturn, have come together now, and they will come together by exact degree on the solstice in December 21st this year. This happens every 20 years, so it's not unusual, but while it's happening during all the other things that are happening, which are many and many more that I haven't even referred to here, it just shows how this is such a turning point, 2020, in our lives, and the biggest turning point I've ever seen studying astrology in all my life. And so it's a big deal when Jupiter and Saturn come together, and it shows big social, economic, global, cultural shifts that are happening around the world. But for you personally, how you may approach it and how we may have to approach it is the big point to make here is that they can join in the sign Capricorn. And Capricorn is ruled by Saturn. So it's Saturn's domain. It's all about Saturn this year. And Saturn, as I said, is more a Stoic philosophy. It's not a New Age philosophy. So a Stoic philosophy obviously is the endurance of pain and hardship without the display of feelings and without complaint. That's a very simplistic definition. If you just Google it, that's what you'll get. But really, Stoicism is much more than that. It's a whole philosophy of approaching life, and you could say the good life, by simplifying our lives. And I'll talk a little more about this in another slide, but it's really about simplifying. It's about what we can do without. Whereas the New Age philosophy is in stark contrast in a way, because it's about a broad movement characterized by alternative approaches to traditional Western culture and interest in spirituality, mysticism, holism, environmentalism, but it's very expansive and hopeful and idealistic view, a New Age view. And so they're in stark contrast. And because they're coming together again on the solstice in winter, in Saturnian time of year, we're heading now into the autumn, and we're feeling this drying up effect already. And as we feel the drying effect after the heat of the summer, if you're in a hot place on the planet, after heat comes dryness. And then as the autumn dryness kicks in, it goes into this winter season, which is the Saturnian time, the dark time of the year for most of us on the planet. So there is this kind of need to, at the Saturnian end of the year, at the solstice, as these two planets come together, to develop a more Stoic philosophy. In other words, to endure, to do without. And so that's really the need this year in 2020 more than anything. I'll talk a bit more about this, and I talk now about how to approach Saturn. How do we take on Saturn in a more positive way? I'll talk about practical as well as traditional Indian astrology approaches to this. So one thing to ask, first of all, is what are you committed to? Because Saturn represents commitment, but we're all committed to different things. So the simple answer to that is just look at what shows up in your everyday life. Whatever you've got going on around you, whatever thoughts you entertain, whatever you do every day, whoever you're with, whatever you're doing, whoever you're spending your time with, and you'll see the results in your life. So whatever you're committed to, in other words, Saturn shows you that. That's neither good nor bad. It just shows you the results. So we just get out what we put in. That's as simple as that. Saturn just is like the accountant. The accountant just shows the figures. There's no emotional attachment to it. There's no processing emotionally around that. Saturn can be very detached emotionally. Archetypally, it's a very detached sort of quality, right? So what are you committed to is a good question to ask yourself. Literally just look at your life experience. And here we have what we could call the two sides of Saturn, perhaps without referring to it as good or bad, but let's just say there's two sides to Saturn. Like any planet, like any sign of the zodiac, like any house of the zodiac, you're talking about two sides. And I guess, kind of have to think about it as in, like, we need to kind of be aware what side we're on. Think about lines on the road as well. What side of the road are you on? Saturn is all about lines on the road, restriction, like rules that we have to live by so that everything runs well. So on the one side, we have Saturn as patience, maturity, physical maturity, obviously, like I said, old age, but also emotional maturity through hardship. So if we suffer, we emotionally mature. So Saturn represents this maturity that we don't often have as a young person, that we develop as we get older. Saturn represents forbearance, commitment, industriousness as well, as someone who can really work hard and commit to something and do what it takes, and due diligence and all of that. So responsibility, sustainability, doing the right thing, something that you can sustain over a long period of time. Diligence, consistency, detachment. Another key lesson of Saturn is the ability to work hard, but just for work's sake, not for a reward, not to think I'm going to get something out of this. And this is again why the people who are Saturn, like the caregivers, the servers, all the service industry, they're not looking for a reward. They're just doing it because they want to help. well, that's at least a positive expression of Saturn. It's like you do it for no reason than just for the doing it. Saturn also represents austerity, acceptance, self-imposed restriction, i.e. focus, meditation, spirituality, reality, and truth. So it just shows you what is again. It just shows you the truth of the situation. Now, there's a theory, or you could say even a philosophy in astrology, where if a planet is very strong in transit, and we all experience that, or you personally experience it in your own life, as in through a transit or a cycle of Saturn in your life, for example. In Indian astrology, we look at cycles in a person's life. And if you go through a Saturn cycle, for example, you could have any amount of these traits on either side, you know, and you could have a mix of both, right? You could have some seeping through here and some, you know, to the other side. So it depends on what side you're in, or, you know, on your own personal chart. So if you're not experiencing all of these, what we could term more positive attributes of Saturn, you're likely going to experience the other side of that. And so the theory goes, and this is the theory I have, I feel it works really well. I've looked at it and it works really well in my own life and in clients' lives. The more we take on the more positive attributes of Saturn, the less we have to experience the negative, the more negative attributes of Saturn. It's like we just bombard ourselves with all these positive attributes, patience, maturity, forbearance, and all of these things. And then we squeeze out all of these negative attributes, which would be fear, anxiety, worry, pain. We impose pain on ourselves, actually. One of the ways that we approach Saturn remedially is actually to enforce restriction on ourselves, meditate every day, enforce pain on ourselves, exercise, all these things that we know we should be doing, but we don't necessarily do. And we're going to feel it in a different way than if we don't do them. And these kind of more negative ways. So limitation, felt as stress, pressure, inability to focus on the task at hand, overly concerned with consequence. Saturn is also called the Lord of Time. So we become very aware of time. How long is this going to go on for? When is this lockdown going to end? When is this all going to be over? What if I do this? And what will happen if I do that? It's all this kind of time, consequence, and fear that is generated here. Doubting what we're doing in the first place, doubting everyone else who's supposed to be an established authority on a subject. So we doubt everyone's inability to move, and laziness. So Saturn can represent laziness as well, and Saturn is the slowest moving visible planet. So it slows us down and we need to slow down with it. But of course that could lead to kind of not being able to move at all. The other side of that is people may rebel and move too much or move around too much to avoid things, always on the go, avoiding issues, not wanting to settle and just be with themselves. Shirking responsibilities, lack of acceptance, and antagonism. One of the biggest things we're seeing in the world at the moment is this antagonism. So Saturn represents questioning everything and everyone. You're not going to take anyone's word for it. You just don't believe anyone. It's this doubt and this antagonism that can really prevail. And so because Saturn is so strong right now, it's one of the strongest planets going on in the zodiac. So it's likely, if you're not experiencing all these positive traits of Saturn on the left-hand side, that you will experience the more negative traits on the right-hand side. So again, the theory is that the more you bombard yourself with the positive, you squeeze out the negative. So ways to do Saturn in Capricorn. So simple thing is just simplify your life as much as you can. Do a clear out, literally, your environment as well as a detox. Less is more. So do you really need to do with all those things that you used to have before that probably were in excess? Saturn is certainly nothing about excess. It's about removing everything that we don't need. This simple life, which is the good life. Saturn is actually about the good life, but it's a different approach. Do some mental accounting, which is a very Stoic way of looking at the world. Just change your mental attitude towards things. Spend some time alone in contemplation when Saturn is strong in Capricorn. Focus on what Saturn and the sign Capricorn represents for you. I can't tell you this in this presentation, but Saturn and Capricorn both would represent a certain area of your life where you need to focus more so. And that's dependent on the house position in your zodiac, in your horoscope. So whichever area of your life that is, and you might be aware of that even without astrology, you might just be aware that there's a keenly focused point of interest in your life right now, and that you're really having to work hard at that and take responsibility for this area of your life. Meditate on loss. Another Stoic part of Stoicism is meditate on loss. Imagine the things that you have are gone. Imagine everything you have is gone, and you'll be more grateful for them. It's another approach to gratefulness, but unlike the New Age philosophy of Jupiter, which is just be grateful and make lists of things that you're grateful for and in a wish to have more, Saturn is about imagining you have less, imagining the things that you are currently with are gone, imagining it's all gone, and then it gives you a sense of enormous sense of gratitude for them, now that they're still here, that you're still here, that you have life to live. So this is a more Stoic approach, a Saturn approach. Exercise is a big one because Saturn actually rules the muscles in astrology. They're the worker of the zodiac. Saturn represents the workers, the menial tasks, the workers of the world that have to do all the hard work, like put their back into it. You know, Saturn rules the back and the knees, for example. So it's all the hard working parts of the body, but also the muscles. So exercise is such a crucial part of Saturn in keeping young, because again, it's a planet of longevity. And I have this trick here, and you might have heard of it. It's 5 minutes of pain, because Saturn is pain. So it's about bringing pain deliberately into your life in more positive ways. And so when you wake up in the morning, if you find it difficult to get out of bed, you just keep saying to yourself, 5 minutes of pain. That's all, 5 minutes of pain. And then it makes you get out of bed quicker. And because you just know it's just going to take 5 minutes to get up and going. The same with any exercise. It's harder to start exercise, but just tell yourself, I'm just going to start. It's going to be painful for 5 minutes, and then I'll get into it. But exercise is crucial for Saturn. And why initially, when we saw the initial lockdown, we saw people going out exercising a lot more, and people were thinking about their lives in that way a lot more and simplifying their life and doing what they needed to do. And so we saw a lot of positive things come out of lockdown initially as well. They seem to have slid back a little bit, but I think we're going to see the return to that. Slow down is another key point, though, because Saturn is the slowest visible planet. So it's all about slowing down, paying attention. Breathe less. This is another key thing. Saturn is air, remember? And there's a saying that we are only given a certain amount of breaths in our life. So it would obviously be beneficial to slow the breath down if we only have a certain amount. And of course, breathing more, over breathing, and breathing through the mouth, which tends to mean over breathing, is not an efficient way of breathing. So breathing through the nose and slowing it down, and yogic techniques involve a lot of slowing the breath down, and the breath becomes so slow that it's almost imperceptible, where you're breathing and sometimes even retaining the breath to the point where you're barely breathing, and even while exercising. So you see people who do these kind of extreme sort of high altitude training. They try and train in that kind of environment where they don't need, or they train the body to do more with less breath. So there's a whole science behind that if you want to look into it. But the astrology behind that is that Saturn represents longevity. The less we breathe, the longer we live. And you could also look at just simply oxidative stress and all of that when we overbreathe, etc. So Saturn is, again, the worker of the chart. So work hard. And the key thing here is, but let go of the need of reward. So we're just working for work's sake. And serve others is another key attribute of Saturn. And if you know anyone with very strong Capricorn in their birth chart, they are very service oriented. They're able to step back and do the work in the background to help other people. Now the sun, we could go on and on about Saturn, but if we spent all of our time thinking about the problem, i.e. Saturn, all we get is a problem. And so we have to bring in an antidote to Saturn. And the antidote for Saturn is actually the sun. So there's this whole mythology around Saturn being the son of the sun, you know, cast out and all of that. It's out at the outer edges of our solar system in the dark, alone. So it's our dark. So the sun is our light and Saturn is our darkness. Sun is our vitality, Saturn our weakness. So of course it's important, therefore, if you're personally feeling too much Saturn going on, too much of the more negative attributes of Saturn, to bring in, as I mentioned, the more positive attributes, but at the same time, don't spend all your time thinking about Saturn. Bring in the sun. It's the opposite quality. So bring in light, literally. If you can literally get sunlight, if possible in Ireland, you can get sunlight. Otherwise, bring in light and sun and energy in other ways. And that is, one thing is rhythm. Key thing of the sun is rhythm. It is very rhythmic. So the sun moves 1 degree a day, and it's all about rhythm. So an obvious expression of this, and Saturn is very off, you know, it's not very rhythmic, the Saturn. Saturn is very, how would I put it? We lose our rhythm in a Saturn cycle in our life, for example. And where Saturn is moving through our chart, we can either become too slow or we try and overcompensate and overdo it. And we're depleted in one way or the other. So the sun is very rhythmic and balanced in that way. So rhythm is like music and dance and exercise. You know, you get into a rhythm when you walk or run or exercise and dance. Music is very much the sun domain. So it uplifts us. Watch comedies. Laughter is really important, you know, during lockdown, during pandemic. It's really important to bring in those kind of light qualities. Eat wholesome, fresh foods when possible, because that's the sun. The sun, obviously, when you think about green foods and things like that, that's very sun type of foods. But Saturn represents everything that is old or stale. So, you know, which is another kind of sad consequence of lockdown, when especially we initially had the lockdown, we had people like hoarding things in packets. But like eating just nothing but processed foods and stale and old foods and dead foods, it's like, it's not very enlivening and invigorating, and they're not full of life. So try and eat as much as you can, if you can get your hands on as much really fresh, wholesome food. So eat a diet which you can digest. I mean, there's a whole thing of like, you know, different body types, and what is good for one person isn't necessarily good for another. But whichever diet that suits you and that you can easily digest and keep you free of toxins. So the whole point here is that whatever you can digest. And try to include cleanses in your diet. So increase, if you can, more cleansing. Saturn's all about a cleanse, of a detox. Celebrate life on Sundays. It's the sun's day. But after doing a fast, ideally on Saturdays, which I'll talk about now. So Saturn rules Saturday, obviously Saturday, Saturn's day. And traditionally, and in Ireland, this is the case when I was growing up, but you know, wherever you are in the world, you might not have had this particular cultural thing, but Saturday was always the day to do the chores, always the day to clean the house, to do the laundry, you know. So it's also the day to clean our own inner house. So do a detox. A fast is ideal for Saturday. Now, it's not everybody that can do a fast for the whole day, but traditionally a fast for Saturn was observed. This is from an Indian Vedic or Eastern philosophy. And it's actually running at the moment. It runs every year at a certain time of year, around this time of year, for 16 Saturdays in a row. But you could take this on, you know, at any time and do it all year, or do it sometimes when you feel you can, if your health permits. So a full fast, only water is taken from sunrise on Saturday to sunrise on Sunday for a whole 24 hours. And that's the full fast. But if you can't do that, then you could do an intermittent fast for some hours during the day. A lot of people do these nowadays. They see the health benefits. This autophagy, this shedding of old cells, and people, it's really hip right now to do fast, which is great because it's one of the best things for your longevity. If you want to increase your lifespan, fast more. Now you can obviously overdo that, and you have to be mindful of that because you need nutrients, but an intermittent fast 1 day a week is not going to hurt most people. There are some people, of course, that shouldn't fast, and especially those who are underweight and malnourished, or those who have eating disorders or disordered eating in any way. So it might aggravate that. And in that case, maybe just a plain diet. If you were just to give something up on Saturday without giving up food, you could just exclude your usual vices or stimulants or treats, whatever they may be. So that's Saturday. So it's all about cleansing on Saturday, cleaning, clearing out, which is what Saturn is doing. And remember, Saturn is doing that for us all on the planet right now. It's a cleansing process that's happening where we're really looking at our life and looking at, do we need to have that? Can we do without that? Is that excessive? Do I need that in my life? And that's the strength of Saturn. So another thing you could do for, again, remember the sun is the antidote to Saturn, is to actually do some mantras, sacred sound for the sun. You could chant for Saturn to strengthen it, but Saturn is already very strong this year. If it's not strong in your chart, you could think about chanting a Saturn mantra. But here I'm actually giving a sun mantra, 2 sun mantras, to help the quality and the energy of the sun, especially as we come into this time of year, as we move into the winter, when it's the Saturnian time of year where it's going to be dark, as well as, you know, all of that's going on with the pandemic. So one very short mantra for the sun is Om Grini Suryaya Nama. Interestingly, greeny, like the Irish word for sun, is ungreen. So that's a correlation there between the Vedic Indian culture and the Irish Celtic culture. So Om Grini Suryaya Nama. It's a very short, nice one for enhancing the sun. A longer one, which is more well known, is the Gayatri. The Gayatri is a really powerful mantra for the sun. And it antidotes against Saturn, the darkness of Saturn. So in the ancient texts, this initial line wasn't included. That was added later as an invocation. There's an often a controversy, you could say, around this sound here, which is called the Visarga, this H with a dot underneath. You'll hear some people pronounce this as Namaha, another A at the end. But the teachers I follow are very clear about this, that it's Nama. And then in this case, for the Gayatri, it would be Om Bhur Bhuva Swa. However, you could leave that line out entirely, because in the ancient text, it's just these 3 lines, and they're each 8 syllables. This is an important indication here. Each line is 8 syllables. And so you have Tat Savitur Vad Ein Yam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dio Yona Prachodayat. So in order to make this 8 syllables, you have to elongate this E, which is why you have a dash over the E. So you say Tat Savitur Vad Ein Yam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dio Yona Prachodayat. So I'll say it one more time from pronunciation. So again, 3 lines, 8 syllables each. Tat Savitur Vad Ein Yam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dio Yona Prachodayat. This is the Gayatri. You can look it up as well with other resources. Traditionally, it was given from teacher to student as being an initiation. So you are ideally being initiated into reciting this mantra. But there are debates about that as well, and whether, you know, we have access to that here where we are, whatever part of the world you're in also. But just be mindful of that usually there is an initiation, this sort of Shaktipat, they call it in India, where it's like you're given this mantra and it's empowered more by it being transferred in that way from a guru. In that case, if you feel that way about it, also you can just chant a shorter mantra for the sun, like this one here, the Om Grini Suryaya Nama. Another very practical thing, I'm finishing up now, is to help others. This is one of the most helpful things you can do for yourself, is to help others. So if you can think about Saturn representing the elderly, the sick, the poor, and the neglected. So helping those people in any way you can. So charity is one of the best remedial measures, in fact, from the Vedic tradition to alleviate the challenges of Saturn in particular. So helping those people who need help the most. And one last thing, in terms of palmistry, the hand is divided up with the fingers representing different planets, and Saturn represents the middle finger, the long finger. So it's also why people give people the finger. So it's that kind of antagonistic sort of, FU kind of thing with Saturn. There's that side of Saturn, the rebellious side. But in Ireland, we have this saying to put something on the long finger. I don't know if it's an Irish saying, but we say that. And Saturn is that putting something off. And so I'm saying here is don't put it off, because Saturn represents the things that we know we should be doing. And if we don't do them, they're forced upon us. And that's why, like I said at the beginning of this, Saturn oftentimes can feel enforced. Saturn and Capricorn issues feel like they're forced upon us and we have no choice now. And we don't like that when we are forced into something. So if you can take on board the issues that you probably know at this point in your life you should be doing, whatever that might be, whatever it might be, and not to put it off. So that's all I have to say about Saturn in Capricorn today. And one last thing, maybe if you're interested in following my work as in astrology, you could look at timelinerastrology.com, or you could become a supporter or a patron at patreon.com/timelinerastrology. I write daily reports for my patrons. So I'd like to thank you all for listening. And for those that are here live, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in or unmute, and I'll be happy to answer them.